Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg, and our subject, the cutting-edge efforts of a United Way agency to attack social problems, from homelessness of children and families, to low graduation rates of minority students, to crime and high rates of recidivism. And they do a lot more. With us is Leslie Howard. She's sort of the Wonder Woman behind all this. She won't like me saying that, but it's true. She's the president of the United Way of Dane County, which is on the cutting edge of this whole movement. She and her agency, where she has been a president for 23 years, have moved from traditional support to those in distress to trying to create fundamental, positive social change. Thanks for joining us, Leslie.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain how this shifted from when you came to United Way? I've written my assumptions that you were doing more traditional philanthropy when you arrived.
Absolutely, yes. Really, it was in the middle 90s, Dick, that two things happened. Really, one was I started hearing from our donors, and they started saying things like, you know, United Way, you're back every year, you're telling us the needs are greater, and we believe you, and we don't like that. Isn't it your job to reduce and eliminate the underlying causes of these needs that you talk about? And my first reaction was, wow, our donors are naive. Don't they realize how hard it is? They're talking about changing the human condition, not just helping change, how hard it is to change one person's life, let alone the whole human condition. But at the same time, we were asked, and I was asked, to lead an initiative by the editor of our morning newspaper in town around civic journalism, which was kind of a movement that was taking place then. It's kind of faded a bit because the media doesn't have the same kind of resources to have the media be a catalyst for change. And they wanted, Frank Denton at the time wanted United Way to get involved in that. And I didn't really know what we were getting into, but we got involved in looking at what was going on in the schools and the racial achievement gap in particular. And as a result of that work, I realized we were in the midst of what the donors were asking us to do. And that caused myself and my board to kind of take a look at it and say, maybe we should be doing all of our work this way, as opposed to, what we used to do, which was assess the needs in the community, which all United Ways do across this country, assess the needs, raise money, distribute the money, and then evaluate results. So a lot of people were being helped. But if you looked at moving the needle and being able to see and feel the change in the community, you couldn't really point to anything to say, this is the impact of the work that you're doing.
Is this sort of like the old cliche of give someone a fish and they eat for a day, teach them how to fish and they...
Yeah, I think it really builds on that philosophy. I think it really does.
And so what year did you really start making and implementing these ideas?
Well, we started working on what the Schools of Hope initiative in the mid-90s, so about 95. I think that we started seeing that it was something about maybe 98, 99, and it wasn't until 2001 that we had gone through a process where the board really looked at, okay, let's change all of our work and move everything in this direction.
And as I understand it, you are involved in about $17 million a year of philanthropy.
That's
Is that
right.
Pretty close?
Yes.
And is that enough to make a difference and make fundamental changes?
Frankly, I think that doing the work this way is the only way to really have an impact and leverage. When you look at the scope and scale of the private sector, the scope and scale of government, and the scale and scope of the needs and the problems we're talking about, you could look at any amount of philanthropy, and if you're just kind of putting it through and not have the impact unless you're leveraging the private sector and leveraging government, which when you do the work this way, that's what happens.
Why don't we understand this by looking at one thing? There's 6 or 7 areas I know you're focusing on as an agency.
Yes.
But let's pick one. How about, I read your material, and it seems to me looking at crime and recidivism is a fairly easy one to understand how you did it.
Yes.
So why don't you explain what you're doing before in the area of this and how you changed?
Right. And, this is interesting because this is an area I didn't even really want to get involved in. But when you look at safety and crime, it's something everybody's very, very concerned about. One of our volunteers, and philanthropy has volunteers very much involved, wanted to look at the issue of crime. And what we found out is that each year in our community, and of course this goes on all across this country, about 700 people were released back to Dane County from prison. Because when you get released from prison, you go back to your home place.
In an metropolitan area, you just put 0 after this number.
Exactly.
Chicago and New York, same story.
Exactly.
Okay.
So people go to prison, they come back out. And I'm sure the statistics are the same within a small range anywhere where you might go. 66% of those people were reoffending within 2 years.
Wow.
So when we looked at that and looked at our crime rates in the community, because one of our goals was to reduce the crime rate, we realized, wow, a significant portion of crime in our community is being committed by this very small group of people. Well, then you would say, should United Way be involved in this? What could we do? We looked at a program and an initiative that talked about getting connected to the folks before their release, so working with the Department of Corrections, finding out where they're going to be, then connecting them with a volunteer who's going to help them with employment, residency, treatment, and support.
Okay, back up a minute.
Yes.
Where do you even begin? Here you go, okay.
Yeah.
2/3 of the people who get out of prison 2 years later, they're back.
Right.
These people are doing bad things in those 2 years, creating crime in our community.
Right.
Where do you begin to figure out what is the right protocol, the most effective protocol?
Thank
That's
you.
what I want to know.
Okay, well, thank you. 2 things. Thanks for slowing me down here. One is you've first got to do a lot of research and evaluation of the data to understand even what I told you, that, X number of prisoners, X number are reoffending. So you really have to take a look at first what's the scope and scale of the problem and dive into the data around the problem. Okay. Then, what are the research and best practices that work around this kind of problem?
Okay, good. So
And
you look
that's
at the
different.
research and best practices, what reduces recidivism.
That's right.
Okay.
And so we look at all the national research. We look at you can use your university, the University of Wisconsin, wherever, the experts in this area, to look at what the research is, to see if anybody else in any other community has worked on this. And that's kind of a different approach for the nonprofit sector, to rather than just getting people together and say, well, what do we want to do and how should we solve this, and we all have a strong opinion about it. Let's look at what works.
Look at the data.
And see if we can, because we are so fragmented with so many different approaches and so many different things going on. So
who did you bring in on this? What areas of expertise?
Well, we brought in law enforcement. We brought in experts in criminal justice system, the people of Department of Corrections. We did our own evaluation of the research. We often will get professors from the university or small colleges involved.
So it's like you create your own think tank.
We have a think tank. We put a delegation together of experts who are involved in the area, and they study the problem for sometimes 9 months, sometimes almost the time of a birth of a baby. Wow. Sometimes it takes a year to really dive into the data, look at the research, and have all the stakeholders involved, including the providers of service, to kind of look at the problem. I mean, one of the things we found out is that when people are being released from prison, they may all be located in the same apartment building. Well, not a very good plan, and or that they weren't able to be signed up for public assistance if they were going to be eligible before they got out. So then you have...
They had to wait till they got out to sign up?
Right. So think about that. You might have a stream of income versus no, and you get out and get frustrated, and this is what was happening. It's kind of like...
Well, why wouldn't you, day one, when you get out, say, I want my public assistance starting now?
Well, you would, but it would take you months to get it.
Oh.
Versus,
because of bureaucracy?
It might be Social Security. Well, it just takes time to fill out those forms. It might be food stamps. Who knows? The point is, if you do it while you're there, and then you come out and you've got this. But what's probably more important, when you think about going to the movies and seeing, those movies of people coming out of prison and being dropped off in the desert, and somebody drives away, it's kind of the way it is. And at first, the ex-offenders are optimistic, and they try to do what they're supposed to do and meet with their parole agents. But in a couple of weeks, they don't have a job, they don't have a good place to live, they have no family support, they get mad, they go back to what they were doing before. Instead...
Can you blame them?
No, I mean we put people through a prisoner simulation here, and I'm telling you, Dick, anyone listening today, you go through that, you realize there, but for the grace of God,
Okay, can you take us through it in a minute? What did you see when you saw that simulation?
It's impossible to meet all the expectations. I've got to meet with my parole officer. I've got to go sign up for a job. I've got to go do something to deal with where I'm living. I've got health issues. I've got to get across town to go pick up some groceries. I don't have any transportation. I don't have a paycheck. So
it's a catch-22.
It's a catch-22, exactly. Yeah. Trying to meet all those. As opposed to getting hooked up with a volunteer who has the ability to get you oriented, to support you, to get you into treatment, to help you get a job, to help you get an apartment or stay where you are. And it costs us about $500 a year per person, as for what we invest, versus $32,000 if you're in prison.
Let's look at the math of that. I'm good at math.
Yeah.
So I like numbers.
Yeah.
So $500 a year. So 2 years you spend. Let's look at the person who'd go back in 2 years.
Yes.
That's $1,000 you spend.
Right.
And let's say they go back for another 5 years.
Yes.
If you didn't spend this money.
Right.
That's $32,000. That's $160,000.
Right.
Okay. And now the rate of recidivism was 66%.
Right.
Can you measure your effect of this program on the rate of recidivism?
Recidivism is now down to 21% overall, and 5% for the people that are in our program. So, because we don't...
Well, wait a minute. Did that rate of recidivism go down to 22 for nothing related to what you're doing?
No. I mean, the 6% was driving it.
Okay. So you took it from 66 to 6.
Yes.
That's 60%.
Right.
So on those 60%, on those people, which is most of the people who went back are not going back.
Right.
That's an amazing savings to society.
Yes.
That's 60 people times how much a year? I forgot. In prison?
32,000.
That's $1.8 million.
Right.
A year.
Right. Not
for
to
almost
mention
peanuts.
Right. So that's the cost of the prison. Think about the cost to society of the crime.
Mm-hmm.
The victims of the crime, all of that
the
occurs
DA
as well.
And the lawyers and the
Yes.
whatever. That's a pretty startling statistic.
I mean, it's tremendous. And this is one of the areas where we really learned we could affect, the bottom line.
Okay, so United Way, I'm sorry.
It's good.
My mind works linearly. I have to follow this.
Yeah.
So United Way, how do you, with your money, make this happen? How do you control all these agencies and how it works and so on?
Well, that's one of the biggest challenges, control. There's control and then there's control. Probably the best way is to inspire people. Because you get all the people in the room who have a concern and interest in this area and start to inspire people with what's possible. And then look at the research and best practice and set some goals related to what we're going to try to accomplish. It's hard for people not to get on board.
Okay, but it seems to me if somehow they had money they were getting from you and you could say you don't get it unless you do this, then it really would work.
Well, and what happens is we don't really create the change that way, but the money does change. I mean, and that's exactly what happens.
So you do have financial incentives to get people on board?
Well, we've become much more prescriptive in terms of what we want to do. And so we know what the problem is. We don't just say, okay, have a bunch of people come in and tell us what they like funding for, or even about this. We say...
And that used to be the model. People just throw out their apps to you and you'd review them and who has the best app.
Right, and we had areas we were interested in, and we had accountability, and we knew that a lot of people were being helped. But we weren't as prescriptive in terms of saying, okay, this is our goal. We want to reduce the recidivism rate. We believe these are the researchers and best practices. We want to find a provider or a vendor to do that, much more like a private business would. And we're going to be evaluating this and tracking this not only in terms of what you're doing, provider or nonprofit, but also how it's affecting the overarching problem in the community, because we want to be able to point to the community and say, this is the impact that your philanthropy has had.
And your assumption is if recidivism goes way down by your program,
yes,
you have reduced crime in the community.
And we have, and it has. That's the other thing. So you see at the same time recidivism has gone down, crime in our community has gone down.
Do you care about the con? Is that part of your goal, to make a better life for the person who would otherwise commit a crime?
I've been in this business a really long time. A lot of the people that we work with in here are not, I'll say, very sympathetic characters. Mm-hmm. And if you started there, I don't know if I would be that motivated, to tell you the truth, because I've seen the effects of crime, whether it's, child abuse or sexual abuse, horrific kinds of things. Yes. Yes, human beings deserve that help and deserve that concern and that empathy on our part.
Okay, so your main client here is the community and the victims of crime, not the perp.
That's right. Our real main purpose is to improve safety in our community, and in the meantime, So
okay. So could you outline in no more than 1 minute what are the changes you've made and what happens to someone when they get out of prison?
Oh, so for this specific.
For this program, what are the differences now
in
your program?
The main difference is we work from the time they're in prison. We hook them up immediately of getting out with a trained volunteer who makes sure that they're getting employment, residency, support, and treatment.
How can you make sure someone gets a job?
We work with employers.
You do?
Yes.
And they'll hire an ex-con?
Yes, definitely.
They got to be pretty well-trained volunteers, because a lot of people can't get a job who have good resumes and aren't ex-cons.
I know. And I'm not saying it's 100%, but that's all part of the support.
Yeah. And if they don't get a job, are they going to recommit, or is there any...
Well, again, those are the four parts of the stool.
Right.
And it could make it more risky, but I think with that support, people have more patience and willing to kind of hang in there to get to reintegrate in the community.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you at the end of the program, but if people want to learn about this in your program, in this one area,
yes,
in all your programs, how would they do that?
The best way is to go to our website, www.unitedwaydanecounty.org.
Why does everyone say www? You don't
have to do that anymore. I know, it's so silly. I just realized that the other day.
Yeah.
UnitedWayDaneCounty.org.
Right.
And you can go in and
let me say that slower. United Way, Dane County, D-A-N-E, county.org.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And you can, there's a spot that says resources, and you can click on mobilization plans, and there's a mobilization plan in the area of Journey Home and recidivism that will lay this whole thing out for them. It's a mobilization plan that's like a cross-section between a social science research paper and a business plan that explains how to do it.
How many United Way agencies are doing what you're doing now?
Well, the whole United Way system is moving in this direction.
Did you start it?
Well, I don't want to take that much credit.
Not you personally, but were you on the forefront?
And even for my United Way, I don't want to take that much credit, but we definitely were on the forefront. I mean, we were doing this and talking about this in the mid-'90s, and I'd go to our national meetings and talk to people, and they just sit there staring at me with, like, what are you talking about?
Uh-huh.
And we've eventually moved and evolved, and we have a center of excellence here every year where United Ways from all over the country come, about 60 or 70 of them, and we put them through training related to this community impact.
Great. Let's move on to the next social problem. The title here is Attacking Social Problems.
Yes.
United Way.
Yes.
Okay. There's a huge gap in graduation rates for minorities, I think African Americans most so, and white kids. You noticed that that's a problem you wanted to work on, right?
Absolutely.
Tell us how you attacked that one.
Well, and this was actually the first one that got us involved in doing this community impact work, because when I described earlier about being asked by the newspaper to get involved, it ended up being the racial achievement gap. And I remember at the very moment sitting there and seeing the reporter up front with all the data on the board and thinking, we can do something about this.
Tell us about the data. Do you remember roughly what kind of numbers?
Sure. When we started working on this, if you look at first of all, in our community, and again, these statistics bear out a little bit differently, but about 15% of our communities of color, but now 50% of the kids in our schools are of color. So this is the future of our community. This is the future of our nation. Yes. At that time, 29% in third grade reading below standard, which means you're not reading anywhere where you need to be, 29% of African American students, 22% of Southeast Asian students, and 10% of Latino students were below standard, compared to 5% of white, Japanese, and Chinese students. So you can see there was a big racial achievement gap. And if kids are not learning to read by the beginning of fourth grade, that sets the course where the chances of graduation are lower, their chances of getting pregnant, doing drugs, dropping out of school, getting in trouble with the law are highly increased.
It makes perfect sense, because I've mentored minority kids, and I know they're so discouraged by fifth grade if they can't keep up. They make all kinds of defense mechanisms of, school's not important and who cares and all that.
Exactly.
It hurts.
So we set the goal to begin to reduce the gap by the year 2000. We were told, people took me aside and said, Leslie, don't do this. We're going to
look
look
bad. The
bad.
gap now for third grade, you're not about high school graduation.
Right, we started with third grade reading because we knew, if you start with high school but you're not reading, you got to, so we went.
But the end game is high school graduation.
End game is high school graduation. But we knew that was, and again, looking at the research and the best practices was the most important thing to do is get kids reading. So we set the goal to begin to reduce the gap by the year 2000, and 2 years ahead of plan we did that, and then eliminated the gap by 2005.
Of third grade reading?
Of third grade reading.
Eliminated it totally?
Eliminated the gap.
Come on.
All racial groups get down to below 5% below standard. Yes.
In this school district.
And I'll tell you, this gap exists in every school district in this country, and there's no other place in this country where that was done.
And you haven't yet had the time to see how this feeds out over the many years toward high school graduation.
Well, the kids from that year are now sophomores and juniors in high school.
Wow.
And when we looked at, and we have some other strategies as well that we've added later years, which we can talk about, but we just looked at the ninth grade data in terms of dropout and lack of attendance, and the numbers are tremendous. The dropouts are lowering in ninth grade, so that was from our class that went through there.
Well, are they're not equal to white kids, are they?
Not in ninth grade, no. but
still a little
but
worse
substantially
than the white kids.
better.
The gap is closed a lot.
It's closed a lot, yes. And the other thing, so there's a couple other strategies we can talk about as well.
Sure.
Now we're working on high school graduation, and I'll tell you there it gets a lot more complicated. But one of the things we've just found out, and this is true probably across every district in this country, is that mobility is a huge issue. And some new data that I just have come upon because of some of we just had a joint board meeting with the school board and our United Way board because we thought it would be really good to go through a major evaluation of what's going on. If children are in our district for 4 years, African American students have an 80% graduation rate versus less than 4 years, 50%.
So if they're transitory, moving from place to place, it makes it pretty tough.
Right. Well, but what it means is we have to have strategies for children when they come in because, you know, our society's mobile.
Yeah.
Whether you're poor or rich or in the middle, it's a mobile society. People are moving around. But for kids who are behind or having difficulty to move and then come in and just be kind of thrown in, it's not going to be successful. So we've got to develop strategies that are going to work on kids that come into the district in, let's say, sophomore year in November. What are we doing to get that child up to speed so that they can have that same graduation rate?
Now I'm guessing same strategy here. Get all the players around the table who are involved in this, right? Who are the players in this one?
Yeah, the players in this one included the superintendent, the head of the teachers union, the head of the juvenile courts. We had parents involved, the mayor, the county executive, of course, United Way, Urban League, Centro Hispano, United Refugee Services.
And we're the experts. We're the professors with advisors.
And the head of the School of Education, as well as several professors that work in this area. We had 16 professors.
That's a power team
working with us to help us identify what was best in the research, because this is an area there's so much political debate about, Dick, that you could spend. I mean, we get groups of people together. We could spend the next 4 years arguing about and you know what we think should be done. Now, one of the biggest areas we need to start to focus on is cultural competence, and this is probably one of the toughest. Because there's also the issue of institutional racism and how we tackle that as individuals, as communities, as a school, so that people of color recognize that we are culturally competent, that we are committed to...
Define culturally competent.
Understanding there's differences and supporting those differences and being able to work with people who are different than we are, not assuming because someone walks through the door and looks different than we are that they're going to have a different... expectation or a different achievement desire than we do. And you know, the reality is, as human beings, and we know based on research, it's true. It's the way we are. You know, people perceive that their neighborhood's safer if it's a homogeneous neighborhood. Why is that?
So what's one way a teacher, I assume you're talking about teaching teachers how to be sensitive
teachers, but I'm talking the community also. I mean, it's really a community issue. It's not just a school issue. It's how open we are as a community to embracing and engaging our differences. We've been through some race-forward circles and you know, racial conversations over the years, but how do you really pump that up? I don't sit here today with that answer. That's a part of the answer. But I want to go back to what the research showed us very importantly in this area is if your strategy doesn't have an academic component, you're not going to be successful.
Why?
Well, because it's an academic problem. You know, so the problem, when I look back at the prior strategies that were being used by our district, they were all kind of social service strategies, which are all important and needed to be done, but they needed to have an academic component.
What's an academic? Give me an example.
Like a consistent curriculum, so that there's a consistent curriculum in how to teach reading that's being used all across the district in all the classrooms, that there's teacher training in how to use that curriculum, that children are being assessed, so there's 5 strategies. The third one is the children are being assessed in the classroom before they get to the big test, so you know if they're behind. Then that there's small class size, which actually small class size really helps in the early grades. And then finally, one of our big strategies was trained tutors working in concert with the classroom teacher. Now, one of the things we found out, Dick, is we had tons of tutors working all over town, as every town in this country has. And they're doing nice things after school, in the summer, on the weekends. But the research shows you need to have trained tutors working in concert with the classroom teacher. Because what was happening is you're going away with your tutor doing over here whatever, as opposed to finding out what the teacher needs to have taught.
Yeah.
So we've got now we have coordinators working in all the schools who recruit, and we have thousands of volunteers who go through training working with the teachers in the schools, which is one of the reasons we were able to get the results in the reading. Now we're working on algebra completion before 10th grade. We've gone from like 30% completion rates for Latinos and African Americans up to 50 and 60% respectively.
And what is it for whites?
It was 70%, something like that, and no, I think it was 65%, and now it's up to maybe 80%.
Okay, so you're closing the gap.
Closing the gap.
Wow. Aren't you a little frustrated, or... I mean, I'm listening to you thinking, why don't people just go to all your research instead of reinventing the wheel in every community?
Yeah, but, you've got to really look at... What's important about it is the model of identifying the goals, evaluating the data, using research best practices, getting the community engaged in the scope and dimension of the problem.
Yes.
Because everybody's going to be at a bit of a different point. Everybody's going to have different resources.
So you have to bring them to the same table.
You've
so
got
they're
to bring
working
them
together.
Exactly. Because that's the power there.
Okay. Let's move on to one more subject here.
Yeah.
Homelessness.
Yes.
Families and single women. Is that your...
Families with children.
Families with children.
Yes.
Okay. And how did you attack that one?
Wow. I mean, this is a big one. Mid-70s, you go across this country, virtually all the homeless were single adult men. Mm-hmm. Now, 50% of the homeless, between 50 and 60 across the country, are women with children. And it becomes a terribly vicious cycle. But one of the things, and across this country, the way we deal with homelessness is emergency shelters. Right? That's the logical.
That's treating the symptom.
That's treating the symptom. What we found
Which is, by the way, the reason I asked you on. You are moving from treating the symptom to working on changing the game.
Changing the game and getting the underlying causes. What we found out is that if you go to an emergency shelter, you only have a 37% chance of ever getting out of the shelter system.
No kidding.
That's across.
For years you'll be in the shelter system.
Pretty much forever. You'll be in the shelter system or some kind.
This is true for the women with children as much as it is for men?
Everybody.
Wow.
But we're focusing on women with children, or families with children. It could be mom and dad. It could be dad with children. But it's really getting children out of homelessness. Okay. But we found something called Housing First. You can have the same problems. It can be unemployment. It can be lack of education. It can be a mental health problem. It can be an alcohol problem. It can be whatever. Domestic violence, which is one of the big causes of homelessness for families.
Fleeing an abusive spouse or partner.
Right. That's a huge
heading to the streets because you got nowhere else to go.
Right. But if same problem as someone who goes to shelter, but we identify you at the shelter door or wherever you are, and keep you in your housing, provide aggressive case management, landlord-tenant support, and help subsidize you, 80% chance of remaining independent. And it's half the cost of shelter.
Well, let me understand this. If someone's about to leave their apartment,
right, they're getting kicked out.
They're getting kicked out
because, let's say, they're getting kicked out because 3 months ago they didn't pay their rent. The landlord wanted to be nice. Said, "Okay, we're going to continue." Next month, 3 months later, the landlord said, "Sorry, I can't do it anymore."
Right.
We find out. We go in and help subsidize, find out what's going on, aggressive case management, financial counseling, all kinds of support. 80% chance of remaining independent.
Wow.
And it's half the cost of shelter. If there's shelter, you go back
to homeless shelter?
Homeless shelters, right.
Is that expensive, homeless shelters?
Well, you think about it, it's kind of like prison. What you have to build and develop to be able to house people, heaven help us, you're not having people living in parks. I mean, and that does happen across this country. But the cost of building and keeping a shelter, and then what occurs in that shelter in terms of, as a parent, you lose control. Now somebody else is in control. And it goes back to almost the prisoner simulation I talked about earlier, where kind of catch-22, difficult to try to get yourself back up. So it's not that there's something wrong with shelter or anybody's intention, but it becomes so dysfunctional as a family to give up all of that control and responsibility, very difficult to get back out of it.
Flesh that out, if you would, a little bit. So now you say a woman has an abusive husband and she flees with 3 kids in tow.
Yes.
And she goes into a homeless shelter. what's the catch-22s then from her ever getting out of there?
Right. Well, I mean, she's now has her family, her kids there. Now someone else is deciding when she gets up, when she goes to bed, when she's going to eat her meals. She probably is going off to try to get a job or to get treatment for her problem. Meanwhile, someone's getting her kids off to school. Mm-hmm. The kids start to lose respect for mom, or think, well, mom's not really in charge. Then the children, depending on their age. I mean, Dick, one of the saddest things. Really young children who don't even realize how different their lives are than anybody else. But then when children start to realize, the little boy, I hear the story who said, I had draw a picture of my house, but I'm not sure how many windows to put on it because I don't know where I'm going to be tomorrow.
Oh.
But anyway, so back to this. So all the decisions are taken away. As opposed to you stay where you live, your decisions stay where you are, you get support, and you're able to remain. We have better than 80% success rate for the people we've been working with, and it's half the cost, so we can do more of it.
Wow. What has been, I think you're doing this in 6 or 7 areas.
Yes.
We've touched on 3 of them.
Yes.
What has been your biggest disappointment and your greatest success?
The greatest success was, we have a couple. I mean, I think early on, the 4th grade reading success, but right with that goes the biggest disappointment because it doesn't, the whole issue doesn't go away. We have to keep working at it. And sometimes over a period of time, you have to go back and re-engage the community to get back on board.
So it hasn't, in the end, toward high school graduation, hasn't been as successful as that
early on. So we have to really drill down now in high school to get that figured out. And that's where this issue of the time in the district, makes a difference. But my biggest disappointment is maybe people not believing that it's possible.
Okay.
A big part of my job is convincing people we should even try. Because, those people who've been in this work a long time will say, we've tried everything, we've spent all this money. Leslie, don't make us look bad. We've tried it and we're going to look bad.
How about your biggest success?
Well, the biggest success is eliminating a racial achievement gap in 4th grade reading when no one else across this country has been able to do that.
Sounds like you have a lot of successes to brag about.
And we have several others, yes.
Okay, again, if people want to learn about this cutting-edge program that really might help all around the country,
UnitedWayDaneCounty.org. Go to the mobilization plans in Schools of Hope, in Achievement Connections, all these areas we talked about and a few others, and you'll find the outlines there.
Leslie Howard, thanks very much for joining us, and I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.